Okay, so agricultural revolution, pretty self-explanatory probably. Agricultural, of course, is a fancy word for what? For farming. So agricultural revolution just means the beginning of farming, okay, the advent of farming, where humans start learning how to farm, how to grow their own crops, and developing those techniques and developing that technology. And the thing is, to me, about the agricultural revolution, it sounds, one, obvious as to what it is, but it also makes it sound kind of simple, like this was no big thing. Like, okay, they figured out how to farm, they figured out how to, put some seeds in the dirt and watch things grow. But this is a really big deal because it requires some technology and it requires some scientific know-how in order to be able to do that. So it represents a very, very big development as far as, human development. But the other thing this means is if people are able to grow their own food, what does that mean that they could potentially stop doing? Traveling so much, yes. It does mean they could potentially stop following the herds all the time. That doesn't mean they always will. Some of that's going to, they may choose not to do that. A lot of that's going to depend on environmental factors. And it doesn't mean that hunting and gathering ever totally stops. We'll always see societies utilizing that as a means of finding food and supporting their way of life. But it does also mean that they can start growing crops, which means that they can start settling down. They can start staying in one place. They can start putting down roots somewhere, as it were. And once they can do that, that means that more complex societies can start to develop. More complex civilizations can start to develop and will start to develop. Because now that they're in one place, that means that, larger groups of people are going to start congregating together, as opposed to maybe just a handful of families. Maybe now it's dozens or even hundreds of families that are beginning to live together in one place. And when they're not having to move around so much and so quickly, now those, small huts and, one room little makeshift shelters, now they'll start working with stones and things that are much sturdier and things that are much more substantial. And the tools that were used for agriculture, again, that translate into tools and technology being used for other things too, like building and that kind of stuff. So these small little villages are going to start turning perhaps into, bustling little towns, and eventually even into massive cities, and eventually even into massive empires. And keep in mind, again, we're not just talking about the Americas here, this is worldwide. In fact, the agricultural revolution did not start in the Americas. It started in the Middle East and then eventually, comes to the Americas over several hundreds and hundreds of years. But this means big, big changes. And it's a big, like I said, game-changing event just in human development, because it means that things are going to start becoming more complex. Things will start becoming more stable. We'll start to see more, complex social structures, complex political structures, all those things starting to develop, more complex religion, more complex culture. All of that goes back to agriculture. Simple and as mundane as farming might seem, it is a huge, huge development in the history of all kinds of people. And it also isn't really that old. We kind of tend to think that agriculture has always been around. The farming's been around for so long, and it has. But actually, if you look at the amount of time that scientists, paleontologists, and people that study those things believe that humans have been on the earth, and then look at the amount of time that they believe we've been farming for that existence, it's a tiny, tiny bit, just a blink of an eye, really. So it is relatively new in the grand scheme of things. So agriculture eventually comes to the Americas, just as it had come to other parts of the world. Get this back. Okay. And eventually, that's going to mean lots of new societies and more complex societies developing in the Americas. So this is our next little subsection. Now, sometimes the slide will change, and that little subsection, the A to B or whatever it is, won't change. So you do not have to write that down every single time. So you only write that part down when it changes, and then just keep on going from there. All right, so now we're going to look specifically at some societies in the Americas, and really we'll talk for just a moment about some things in Central America as well. Now, as far as Native American societies, again, it's very, very difficult. You could spend all year just talking about Native American cultures. And another thing that's important to realize when it comes to Native American cultures is we don't even know what we don't know. There's, to use a more popular phrase, there is so much about Native American societies that we really do not understand, that we have no record of, there's no telling how many people, how many entire civilizations might have existed prior to the arrival of Europeans that we have absolutely no awareness of, because they were long gone by the time that Europeans arrived. And we also know that when Europeans do arrive, what is sort of their overall opinion of Native Americans? They're savages, they are, heathens, they have no culture, they need to be civilized, and we'll talk about a lot of that stuff later on. So a lot of what did exist for Native Americans, when the Europeans arrived, a lot of it will be destroyed. A lot of it, like I said, was already gone for whatever reason. And as you may remember from your summer assignment, hardly any, relatively, virtually no Native Americans happened to utilize written language. So there's no written record, there's no written documentation. The way we can go back and look at the ancient Romans and stuff like that, we can't do that with a lot of Native American societies because they didn't write things down. And so while we may have pottery or artifacts like that to go on, we don't have any other kind of written document. So again, we don't know what we don't know. And there's all kind of different estimates as to how many people were here when Europeans first arrived, and they range from 50 million to more than hundreds of millions. I mean, there's just really no way to tell. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look not really at specific civilizations or specific tribes or specific cultures. Now, we will mention one or two kind of as an example. And some of these are even cultures that wouldn't have been around anymore by the time Europeans arrive at all anyway. We're going to group this sort of by region, because what's important for us to realize, what we can say, is that we know that Native American societies were diverse. What does that mean, diverse? Different. That there were lots of different Native American societies. We tend to, I think around here and in this room, we're a little bit more enlightened, but a lot of times people, and certainly Europeans, had the idea that all Native Americans were kind of the same, right? That they all did the same thing. They all lived the same way. They all live in teepees. They all ride horses. They all hunt. They all, grow corn, all these sorts of things. Yes, there are common characteristics among Native American groups that tend to show up most of the time, but they were very, very diverse. There were, again, we don't know how many Native American cultures, thousands and thousands. They spoke multiple languages. They warred with each other. They were sometimes allies with each other. They had different cultures. They had different ways of doing things. There were lots of different societies, but a lot of things about those Native American societies was based on their environment. Environmental factors have a lot to do with how these Native American societies developed, kind of the areas.
Teacher, please pardon this interruption. If you will please release the boys' Navy basketball at this time. Again, please release the boys' Navy basketball at this time.
So again, we're going to divide this up sort of by region, by area. Talk a little bit about the things that were common amongst Native Americans in those areas. Keeping in mind, each of these regions, you'd be talking about dozens or dozens, maybe even hundreds of specific tribes within that region. So we'll start with, and what I've done here, you can see, I put numbers here on the map so you can visually see where I'm talking about if you're not sure. So the Arctic up here, and what would today be Canada, what would today be Alaska, and all of this. So what is the environment, the climate, the weather like in that place? It's cold, isn't it? So is agriculture probably going to work out real well there? Probably not. So Native Americans in the Arctic region, they're much more sparse. And it is not going to be agriculture that's going to be very successful there. So in the Arctic region, in that area, you'll see mostly fishing and hunting. Okay, fishing and hunting. Fishing for large sea animals, seals and so forth, and a lot of those Native Americans, that's what their diet was in large part made of. Gathering other kind of foods, but because of that extreme cold, again, there's an environmental factor shaping the lives of certain people. Agriculture doesn't become successful at all there because you can't really grow anything. But this will be like the common name Eskimos. We think about those groups of people, Native Americans, like that. Okay, so again, we're just doing very, very basic, simple characteristics of some of these groups, not talking about specific civilizations exactly. All right, the second region we've got numbered up there is what we call the Great Plains, and Native Americans there oftentimes are grouped together and called the Plains Indians. Although, like I said, you could be talking about dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of different cultures that would fit into that category that would have developed and lived in this Great Plains region. And you can see this includes what would today be, everything from parts of Texas all the way up into your, Kansas and into the Dakotas and Montana and places like that. And you've got lots of different kinds of geography and things there. When we think about the plains, what are the plains? What does that mean? Flat, lots of grass, things like that. So for the Plains Indians, a common factor amongst a lot of them, certainly not true of all of them, but a common factor amongst a lot of them is a nomadic way of life. Using those plains as a vast hunting ground. And this is where, some of us mention those sort of iconic images of Native Americans hunting the buffalo, on the horseback, and all that kind of stuff. That is oftentimes a reference to or an understanding of the Plains Indians. So largely nomads, although they do utilize agriculture, they're not entirely nomadic. There are certainly some groups that lived more settled lives and that did practice agriculture. And when we think of the Plains Indians and their nomadic hunting, teepees, that's true of Plains Indians. So not all Native Americans lived in teepees, but certainly in the Great Plains, that was not an uncommon thing to see. And the Plains Indians, hunting on horseback and all of that, particularly, that doesn't really happen until after the arrival of Europeans, because Europeans are actually going to introduce horses to Native Americans. Horses. I think archaeologists believe there were some very, very ancient species of horses that existed thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, but they were extinct. And then Europeans are going to introduce livestock, including horses, to the Americas, and that will particularly impact the lives of Native Americans like the Plains Indians that will then use that for their hunting of the Great Plains areas. Okay, so hunting and agriculture there. This third region I've got marked here is, says here on this map, northeast. Another way we can look at it is the Great Lakes region. Obviously, we're looking at a pretty big area, but that's going to be all this. You see your Great Lakes here. So this would be, we've got part of Canada here, got parts of what today be Michigan and Ohio, but on into what would be New York and the East Coast here up into Maine, all of this. Okay. In the Great Lakes region, we see lots of different things, a lot of farming. Okay, farming is agriculture. A lot of these Native Americans were farmers, growing a variety of crops. Particularly, what's a crop that often comes to mind when we think of Native Americans? Corn. What's another name for it? Maize, that's right. So that's common amongst a lot of Native American cultures. Many of them in multiple regions grew corn or maize. That's one of the big things, as well as it wasn't the only thing they grew. They grew squash and beans and other kinds of gourd fruits, gourd vegetables and things like that. But farming is a common characteristic. Settled communities most of the time, so these are less likely to be nomadic, most of them living in settled communities, villages. Many of them were trading with each other, working well together. There are some, we'll mention a specific tribe here or there as we move forward. One of which we'll see a lot, which is an example of this area. There's a group around in what would today be New York and places like that, called the Iroquois that we'll talk about. And the Iroquois were pretty powerful by the time that the English start settling a pretty powerful Native American nation made up of multiple tribes. They're kind of an alliance together. So they're a force to be reckoned with when the English start to colonize, and they will always be either trying to ally themselves or work against or whatever with the Iroquois and other powerful nations in that particular region. Okay, same map with different numbers though, so it wouldn't be too much all in one spot. Let's look at this fourth region. That's the Southwest. We'll call that the Southwest. This really includes a lot of different things. But you can see this is what would today be, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Colorado, places like that. And how might you describe kind of the geography of the climate in the Southwest?
Mountains.
Some mountains, yes. That's going to be part of, will kind of tell us a little bit about their culture and society. What else? Weather. It's dry, pretty warm. So again, environmental factors have a lot to do with it. In the Southwest, they are agriculturalists, so they did grow various crops, including corn, tomatoes. Now, if it is very, very dry, though, what are they going to need to do in order to grow those crops well? They need some kind of water. So they actually developed irrigation systems. Even in some of these very dry, arid places, they're able to develop pretty sophisticated, pretty advanced irrigation systems to bring water in to water those crops and allow them to be successful. Some of you mentioned mountains. And the Native Americans in the Southwest region were known for living oftentimes in little cities. These, you may have heard them called pueblos, or these cliff dwellings. You have these cliff dwelling societies like this one here, where they would build these like apartment-like structures. Some of them really, really big, whole cities, kind of carved into the sides of mountains or in the sides of cliffs, made from mud and that sort of stuff. So that was a common characteristic among some of these Native Americans. Sometimes they're called the Pueblo people. And there's, again, multiple particular tribes or cultures that would fit under that category. And these are areas that we'll talk about later. The Spanish eventually will take over. So farming, as well as always, hunting and gathering. Not like anybody ever stops doing that. But the cliff dwellings and the Pueblo spaces really sort of iconic of the Southwest Native Americans. Let's look at this fifth region over here, more close to home, kind of our neck of the woods, the Southeast. This will include, here's the Mississippi River right here. So the whole Mississippi River Valley region, where we are, Alabama, Georgia, moving all the way up into your Appalachian Mountains and all of that. Now the Mississippi River and there's lots, not just the Mississippi River, but there's all sorts of rivers, naturally occurring rivers and so forth in this particular area. So what do you think, all those rivers and so forth, what did that mean as far as the soil and the geography of that area? Very, very fertile, that's right. So once again, agriculture. Very fertile land of the Mississippi River Valley means successful agriculture. So growing a variety of crops, settled communities, and so forth, like we talked about with some of the other, like in the Northeast, kind of similar to that. Now you also have in the Southeast, in some areas, some of the larger, more advanced civilizations. You may have heard of the mound builders or been to a place like Moundville. Mound building was something that some of the more sophisticated cultures engaged in, building these giant, they just look like big mountains that they use for various things. So some of those mounds, the remnants of them are still around today in some places. One of what archaeologists, scientists, and others believe was probably the largest and most sophisticated, most advanced Native American culture in North America was a mound building civilization. You may have heard of the Cahokia around what would today be St. Louis, somewhere in here. Which had long disappeared before Europeans arrived. So again, we're going on, archaeological evidence, but lots of estimates that there may have been 50,000 people or more living in some of those cities, which is not something we usually think about when we think about Native Americans. We tend to have, images of, 20 people, 50 people living in a village, not thousands, but that was true of some of them. And finally, we're going to mention outside of North America and Central America, which would be Mexico or other parts of Central America from, Nicaragua to Panama all the way. And it is in Central America where we see by far the largest and the most sophisticated of Native American cultures. This is where you have those massive, or some of those massive Native American empires. And as large as some cities and some Native American cultures in North America tended to be, none of them really come close to the massive power, massive size, and massive wealth of some of your Central American civilizations. And some of those, one in particular, would still be around by the time Europeans arrived. What do you think was present in a lot of Central American locations that would have made a lot of these tribes incredibly wealthy? They do have agriculture and all that, but what else? Something that the Europeans will be very intrigued by when they arrive. What might have been of value to a lot of European, the Spanish and so forth? What might be worth a lot to them? Can you think of any metals they might have liked? Gold, yes. So there's gold in these areas and silver in South America and other kind of precious stones and things that these Native Americans would, use to decorate things, artwork, jewelry, as well as, massive agriculture, all that kind of stuff. But here's where you're talking about huge cities, huge empires. Best example, and one that we will see again when we talk about the arrival of the Spanish, were the Aztecs. You might have heard of the Aztecs in Mexico. The Aztecs were by far one of the wealthiest, the most powerful Native American empires that had ever existed, that we know of for sure. And the Spanish will stumble upon them and their great wealth and their power and might, and ultimately defeat them. Like I said, huge cities with temples, with roads, with hospitals, with schools, very complex social structure, class system within their society. In fact, their capital city, it's kind of hard to imagine that the capital city of the Aztec Empire was, by the time Europeans arrived, it was bigger than any European city. It was bigger than London, it was bigger than Paris, than Milan, than any of those places, with perhaps millions of inhabitants. So again, really debunks the whole understanding of Native Americans all being primitive and living in scattered villages and all that, which is true of some of them, but certainly not true of all of them. So again, bottom line, there were more cultures here than we can, dare to try to count. So much that we don't know and never will know, because we don't have record of it, and because a lot of it what was here will be destroyed by the time that once Europeans are done with it. But we do see diverse Native American cultures that are in many ways shaped by the environment. We talked about how the environment and the areas around these people really influenced, and this is just another way of looking at it, similar map, influenced sort of how they formed their society and some of the major characteristics of them. So tomorrow what we will do is we will look at Europeans. We will talk about what led Europeans to want to and to have the ability to seek out new places and eventually make contact with some of these Native American cultures. Okay, so we'll start talking about that impact, because they will both impact each other in both some positive, but also, of course, a lot of negative ways. Okay, so